Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Culture Club. I'm Will Bunch, the national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And here's my plug. I'm also an author myself. And so I just want to say I can't wait to talk to you again in August when my next book, which is called After the Ivory Tower Falls, about how college broke the American dream and America's politics, comes out. But today we're going to do something that's really going to be a lot of fun. We're starting a new seasonal event that, as you know, probably we're calling the Will Bunch Culture Club. We just have a great community of people who have been reading my newsletter or reading my columns in the Inquirer and responding and interacting. And so we thought it would be cool to try and take it to another level and do kind of a community thing. So the idea of the Will Bunch Culture Club is an event where we're gonna pick out a book, as we did this time, or a podcast to listen to, or a cool documentary that's coming out, and hopefully a lot of folks will do that. And then after about a month's time, we have an event like this where we're fortunate to get the creator of this great work on with us as a guest. So for the first one, I chose maybe my favorite story from all history, which is the greatest scandal in American history, which is Watergate. So this is I can hold this up. This is the book. I should hold it back a little bit. Watergate: A New History. It's written by Garrett M. Graff, and I'm so excited that Garrett M. Graff is with us today. Thanks, Garrett, for being here with us.
It's my pleasure to be here. What a fun conversation.
It is going to be a fun conversation. Now, there's one thing I got to do before we start real quickly, which is I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items, as we call them, because we want you to know how to be able to participate in today's event. At any time during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions for our guests. To do so, please put questions in the comment section at the bottom of the page. If you're on social media, head over to inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. And I have a hunch we're going to have a lot of good questions today. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to start out, though, with a quick introduction of our guest, Garrett M. Graff. Garrett keeps one foot in his beloved home state of Vermont, which is, if I'm not mistaken, that's where you are now, right, Garrett?
Indeed.
Yeah, that's cool. So, but he has his other foot in Washington. He's considered one of the top political journalists around. He's worked or written for a number of publications. He served as editor of the Washingtonian at one point. Garrett's written a number of books. I'll mention probably the most prominent one, The Only Plane in the Sky, which is really considered the definitive oral history of 9/11. And now he's written another great book, which is Watergate: A New History, which, again, one last time, I'm going to hold it up. It's got a cool picture of a tape recorder on it. And Garrett's book, really just kind of, it's been 50 years since the Watergate scandal. The Watergate break-in occurred on June 17th, 1972. And so we've learned a lot over the years. It's a process of even now we're still learning new things about Watergate. And Garrett tied all of those together in his book. So it's already been a New York Times bestseller. And Garrett, thanks so much again for joining us. I appreciate it. I'm going to use very briefly my prerogative as a host to just do a short spiel about why I picked Watergate, because it's just a story that means a lot to me on a couple different levels. On one level, I think most of you probably have some awareness of Watergate. Maybe if you joined the Culture Club today, or maybe you don't. But Watergate's a catch-all phrase. It really describes this big, sprawling scandal that had lots of elements to it. It began during Richard Nixon's first term as president back in the early 1970s, when his administration was basically at war, metaphorically speaking, with its political opponents, with the media, with anti-war protesters who were a big deal at the end of the Vietnam War. And his response was within the White House, they set up this rogue team that eventually was linked to burglaries and other illegal operations. It morphed into his presidential campaign in 1972. And as we'll probably talk about today, they really either did or thought about some really wild stuff. So when the burglars were caught at the Watergate Hotel in June 1972, it was an epic event, because it started the operatic 2-year downfall of Richard Nixon, but also we're still dealing with the impact because it really started to shatter trust between Americans and their government, and we're still dealing with that. But also, Watergate's a big deal for me personally, and I know there's a couple people watching today, my parents, who can attest to that. But I turned 14 I just turned 14 in the spring of 1973 when the scandal really started taking off. I was, like a lot of 14-year-olds, I was a geeky kid. I was obsessed with starting to get obsessed with politics, and here was the biggest political scandal of all time, right then. So all my memories from those 2 years, 1973 and 74, are really shaded by Watergate. I can remember racing home wet from summer camp where we had swimming lessons, so I could get home in time to watch John Dean testify in June of 1973. And we actually, I think we have a cool picture of what that was like to watch John Dean getting sworn in. It was a huge event on national television. It was a big event for me, the geeky 14-year-old. And I remember in 1974 we took a camping trip up to the Catskills, and instead of fishing, I spent the whole time on my cot reading the Senate Watergate Committee's report, which had just been published. So yeah, I was a Watergate nerd, definitely. But for me also, and really a lot of other people in my generation too, this kind of cemented the idea that journalism was something that could change the world, because we saw the impact that journalists like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein had, and other folks, as Garrett describes in his book. And this was what I wanted to do in my life, and here I am 50 years later, still doing it. So, so the first thing I really wanted to ask Garrett about this was, I'm curious because I know Garrett, and I'm getting this, I think, from Wikipedia, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were born in 1981. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that was 7 years after Richard Nixon resigned. So obviously you have no sentient memory of Watergate. Before you wrote this book, what did Watergate mean to you before you wrote it? And also, I think I'm curious, and a lot of folks are curious, what made you decide to write a book about Watergate?
Yeah. So I, as you said, a case of Wikipedia being exactly accurate. I was born in 1981. I grew up in a family of journalists. My father was the AP bureau chief here in Vermont. His father, who I'm actually named after, was a journalist with the New York Herald Tribune through the 40s and 50s. Started out actually on the other side of Pennsylvania, covering cops in Pittsburgh in the 1930s. And so, I grew up in a family of journalists. And so, for me, the idea of that Robert Redford, Dustin Hoffman movie, All the President's Men, was, the holy grail of journalism. I mean, it was this incredible moment of heroism of journalists. And exactly as you said, sort of this moment where you're like, okay, journalists and good journalism changes the world. Although that story ends up being much more complicated as I understand it now that I've written a book on Watergate. But as because you and I have sort of gotten to know each other through Twitter and social media over the last couple of years. I've spent the last 5 years covering the Trump administration and the Russian attack on the 2016 election, the Mueller investigation. My background was in covering the FBI and national security, and that living through these last 5 or 6 years, has been an incredible lesson in power in Washington and the various levers and checks and balances of the American system. And I went back, but sort of all of that still feels unfinished. Like we're still living in that moment. And so I was curious to look back and try to examine the last time our nation dealt with a moment like this in our presidency. The last time we came close to impeaching a president, the last time we dealt with these epic court battles between special prosecutors and the president and the Justice Department and the Congress and the courts, and was really surprised as I got into looking at the Watergate era over the last couple of years about how we just really don't remember correctly what Watergate actually was. And that, in fact, it is a much bigger, weirder, zanier story than the version that gets sort of filtered down through popular culture and All the President's Men, where you see actually a much darker tale of a paranoid and conspiratorial criminal president engaged in what ultimately end up being about a dozen different but interrelated and distinct scandals that unfold from Nixon's campaign in 68 right through the spring of 74 as he is forced from office. And so part of my goal with this book was to just go back and retell that story with everything that we now know. Watergate is obviously something that has been sliced and diced in 1,000 ways by different memoirs and books over the years. But it's really been more than 25 years since the last time anyone sat down to try to tell the full narrative story of Watergate. And the story's changed a lot since then, which was one of the things that really stuck out to me as I read into it and researched and wrote this, which is, in ways big and small, the Watergate that we sort of thought we knew even as late as the 1980s and 1990s was not the Watergate as it actually played out. And so this book is an attempt to try to tell that story from start to finish, incorporating a lot of new information that dramatically changes the arc of the story, not the least of which is the identity of Deep Throat, that famous anonymous source from Woodward or Bernstein. And the last time someone sat down to write a Watergate history, we didn't know who Deep Throat was. And the idea, again, filtered through All the President's Men, where Hal Holbrook plays the shadowy figure telling Woodward to follow the money in the parking garage. We have this idea that Deep Throat was some sort of democracy saver, that he was someone who was, a Nixon insider, troubled by what he saw and was trying to protect the country, save the presidency, and help, the reporters force Nixon from office. That actually is not what it turns out Deep Throat's motives were at all. Deep Throat, as we now understand it, was the deputy director of the FBI, Mark Felt, and he was pissed off that Nixon had passed over him to be the director of the FBI and was out to sink his successor, or not his successor, his usurper as the FBI director, Pat Gray. And so what we actually have long thought for decades was, Deep Throat trying to protect democracy was actually Deep Throat playing some brutal knife-fighting, bureaucratic succession politics. And there end up being these fascinating sub-stories that unfold now that we understand who Mark Felt and Deep Throat actually were and the role that he played in that scandal. That begins with the fact that Deep Throat actually, and this is sort of great bar trivia for viewers, he didn't actually even start leaking to Bob Woodward. He had started leaking to the crosstown Washington Daily News, which coincidentally in that July of 1972 went out of business. And there's sort of this amazing moment where you realize, had the Washington Daily News not gone out of business in July 1972, would we even know who Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were?
Exactly. Hey, to me, reading the book, as somebody who was a Watergate geek at the time, knowing who Deep Throat is now, really, you're right. It really does change the story arc. I mean, just in general, one thing I really appreciated the book is, to me, the story of Watergate, having experienced in real time, is always the way we found out about it. Things were, the story was told that the way that things were revealed. So, we didn't know about the smoking gun tape that linked Nixon to trying to get the CIA to intervene in the case. We didn't know about that till 3 days after he resigned. I think the beauty of your book is that you're able to tell it as it happened. The things that were behind the scenes that we didn't know about until, like you said, years later, until people wrote their biographies and whatnot. I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about how you tackled a project like this. Not to get too deep in the weeds, but I know I wanted to ask you about listening to the White House tapes, because that's one thing that makes, I think, Watergate unique. Also, is we have these recordings that would have been just people trying to recreate them years later, but now we have tapes of the actual recordings, and we know what people said. And we actually for the audience, we pulled one of the most famous tapes, which is John Dean meeting with Richard Nixon in March of 1973 to tell him about hush money payments that they need to make to the Watergate burglars to try and keep the scandal from blowing wide open. And we're just going to give you a sense of what the tapes are like. We're going to play a little snippet, and then I'm going to ask Garrett to talk about doing this research.
But there's no denying the fact that the White House and Ehrlichman, Hallam, and Dean are involved in some of the early money decisions. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years.
You on the money, you need the money. I mean, you can get.
Well, I think that's where.
What I mean is, you can get $1 million, and you can get it in cash. I know where it can be gotten.
That's amazing to hear the President of the United States saying, that he knows where he can get $1 million in cash to pay off these criminal burglar suspects. So Garrett, how did you pull this off? How did you do it?
Yeah, so let me. I'll start by talking about the tapes and then talk about the research a little bit more. One of the amazing aspects of this story is the role that the White House tapes end up playing in this. Previous presidents, Kennedy and Johnson, had taped conversations in the West Wing, but they had been recording devices that turned on and off. That there were conversations recorded only if the president wanted them to be recorded. Richard Nixon comes into office and tears out that recording system. He, knows that he doesn't want that. But then as his presidency unfolds, he actually thinks his presidency is going pretty well. And that he becomes afraid that he is not going to get credit for his own genius, that he has these treacherous aides like Henry Kissinger who say one thing behind closed doors and then go out to the fancy Georgetown cocktail parties with journalists in the evening and say something else outside the confines of the Oval Office. And Nixon feels that he is being sort of left holding the bag for his administration's failures without getting the credit for their successes. So he installs this secret taping system, doesn't tell any of his top aides, and inserts this fatal flaw into them, which is they are voice activated. And so there's no way to turn them on and off. And for the next couple of years, the tapes just spool along, recording every single thing that's said in the Oval Office, in the old executive office building hideaway, the Camp David, in the residence, in the phones that the president uses. And that these capture this just incredible breadth of strange schemes and criminal plots that Nixon cooks up and the people around him cook up. Part of what you really understand as you get deeper into the story of Watergate is that America, for 50 years, we've all heard the mantra from Watergate is the cover-up is worse than the crime. That's the lesson that it seems every crisis communications person has learned from Watergate and how they counsel crisis response today in all sorts of settings. Well, when you dive into it, actually, the crimes of Watergate were numerous, complex, inescapable, and quite awful in their own right. And these tapes become, the key exhibit of just how corrupt and abusive Nixon's White House actually ends up being.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, and I want to. We're getting some really good questions from folks. So I want to speed things up just a little bit here. I wanted to ask you about having thrown yourself into this project when it was all done. Just your overall perception of Nixon, because they're basically these two storylines we tell ourselves about Richard Nixon, right? One is that he was on the verge of this great presidency in terms of opening up relations with China, having these high-level talks with the Russians, the Soviets. He was actually surprisingly liberal and progressive on a lot of domestic issues, and he was brought down by this tragic flaw. Or is the tragic flaw the real Nixon? I mean, is the paranoia, this impulse to use dirty tricks to win? Is that the real Nixon? What was your impression of Nixon after you finished writing the book?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to study Nixon and not be fascinated by exactly what you talk about. This tragic figure who is on almost any front and measurement one of the great political figures of the 20th century. I mean, he is on the Republican national presidential ticket 5 times between 1952 and 1972. He is the hinge upon which the entire American century turns, as I say in the book's introduction, that he is, ushers out the era of the New Deal and the Great Society, and ushers in this much more polarized and racialized nativist politics that I think in many ways finds its natural conclusion 50 years later in the election of Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And yet, along the way, as you mentioned, he is the first president in the Cold War to visit a communist country. He is the first to visit Moscow. He's the first to visit Beijing. He reopens diplomatic relations with China. He ushers in the era of détente and arms control with the Soviets. He creates the EPA and OSHA. He signs Title IX. He does more to bring women into the management of the federal government than almost any other president before him. He brings the first female military aides to the White House. And yet sort of all of this is overshadowed in the final calculation by this one word that is the sole word of the book title, Watergate. And Watergate becomes, as you were saying in your introduction, basically like the scandal that created modern scandal in politics. And, the way that we still highlight scandals is by tacking the word gate onto them, in realms far beyond politics. The New England Patriots deflate gate. This is how we define scandal for the rest of modern American history.
Well, one reason why, and I think one thing, if you haven't read Garrett's book yet and you're planning to go and read it, I think you'll be just amazed at some of the different schemes, that were talked about either inside the Nixon White House or, were presented to the Republican National Committee, or to the committee to reelect the president, Nixon's campaign, 1972 campaign committee, with this Operation Gemstone. All kinds of schemes about, getting prostitutes to blackmail Democrats and that sort of thing. In fact, a story that was big on social media over the weekend was, this plot that they had to these conversations they had about assassinating the journalist Jack Anderson, which is, some of these things were so crazy. I guess they were never going to get off the ground. But I was wondering for you, for doing the book, what are the one or two anecdotes that you just really said, oh my God, this is just crazy. What are the things that really stand out for you?
Well, what becomes such a big part of the Watergate story is, America believes that Watergate begins on June 17th, 1972, when the 5 burglars are arrested at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate office complex. But in many ways, it was like America walked into the second or third act of a play without any knowledge of how of what had been transpiring on stage before then. Because what ends up really being the downfall of the Nixon administration is that there were so many crimes, so many plots and abuses of power and weird schemes going on, that trying to come clean about any one of them would then unravel some of the other ones. And that sort of everyone involved in one of the scandals was also involved in some of the other scandals. And so this sort of ends up unfurling all the way back really to the beginning of the administration. And one of the most shocking episodes in not just Watergate history, but modern American political history writ large, which we have really only come to understand its centrality to Watergate in the last 10 years, which is this event called the Chenault Affair, which unfolds in the fall of 1968 as Richard Nixon is running for president. And he and his campaign manager, John Mitchell, work with this Washington doyen, Anna Chenault, who coincidentally enough lives in the Watergate condo complex. And she interferes on Nixon's behalf in the Paris peace talks with the South Vietnamese government to keep the Vietnam War going. Literally, Nixon is extending the Vietnam War to keep American servicemen dying in the jungles of Vietnam, because he thinks it is going to rebound to his political benefit. And, this is sort of as close as you come to credible allegations of outright treason against an American political figure in the 20th century. And Nixon's scheme is uncovered by Lyndon Johnson in the final hours of the campaign. He confronts Nixon. Nixon denies it. And then after the election, Johnson decides to keep quiet about it. He realizes that it would undermine the president's authority, undermine the moral authority of Richard Nixon if he speaks about it. And so Johnson classifies the whole thing and buries it. But Richard Nixon knows that Lyndon Johnson knows. And it becomes this sort of moment for him of like sort of Edgar Allan Poe and the Telltale Heart, where Nixon is sort of slowly driven mad through his own presidency as he fears that the evidence of the Chenault affair will surface. And so he, this is what provokes him in the wake of the Pentagon Papers to create the Plumbers Unit, to bring G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt into the president's orbit, eventually assign them the dirty tricks portfolio for his reelection campaign, and really sort of launch the forces that end up resulting in that burglary in June 1972. It's Nixon's fear that this, that his treason will be outed.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that people had no idea of in real time, that there was this, I mean, first of all, the 68 Vietnam thing was just a rumor for years and was never really confirmed until very recently, and people didn't know the link of that to Watergate, and it is an amazing connection. Well, we have a lot of really good questions from people, and I want to go to some of them while we still have some time. One thing that I think people really want to talk about, and you mentioned it briefly in the beginning, is kind of that straight line from Nixon to Trump, because the last 5 years, are on all of our minds, I guess. HB Sherm 61 wants to know, do you think the Trump impeachment had the same impact on the country that Nixon's possible impeachment did? Which is an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't think it did, and in part because the very obvious difference that Nixon's potential impeachment forced him from office in a way that Trump powered right through. And that to me was really the moment that I was interested in writing this Watergate book, was trying to understand sort of what about Washington was different then versus now, and how did and sort of how was a corrupt and criminal president forced from office in the 1970s?
What's the short answer? What was different? I mean, to me, the media is a big part of it, but I'm interested.
The media is a big part of it. To me, what makes the Watergate story so interesting start to finish is that it becomes this incredible story of how power works in Washington. And all of the levers and checks and balances that had to come together, from the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Article 1, Article 2, Article 3, the FBI, the Justice Department, the House, the Senate, the District Court, Appeals Court, Supreme Court, and the executive branch, to all end up coming together to force the president from office. And I think the shortest possible answer to the question of what was different then versus now is what you see is that the Republicans in Congress in the 1970s acted as members of Congress first and Republicans second. And what I mean by that is that they understood that Congress was a co-equal branch of government, and that Congress has a role in holding the executive branch to account, providing oversight and keeping presidential power in check. That in order to be a co-equal branch of government, they had to exercise those prerogatives. And that I think the biggest challenge and the biggest difference that we saw with the way that the House and the Senate reacted to really both of Trump's impeachments is that Republicans acted first as Republicans and not as members of Congress.
Absolutely. We have a good question from Archimedes. He says your book does a great job of weaving together many different crimes and scandals. And as a result, he kept wondering whether Nixon and his criminal associates would have been caught for the other things that they did, that if the third-rate burglary at the Watergate hotel hadn't been detected. I mean, I guess that's one of history's great unanswered questions. But I mean, there were a lot of tentacles to this thing. Do you think some of it would have come out eventually if it hadn't been for the botched burglary?
In part, I do. Partly because actually the plan for the burglars was they were going to keep burglarizing, and that they were never very good at it. The fact that they got away with the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, was sort of remarkable given how ham-handed their efforts were. The burglary of the Watergate, many people forget, was actually the second burglary of the Watergate, where they were going in to fix the mistakes of their last burglary. And that same weekend, that same June weekend, they were actually planning, if they had succeeded at the Watergate, they were going to go straight on to burglarizing George McGovern's headquarters. And they had sort of more plans for more weird shenanigans right through the convention later that summer. So in some ways, they were so bad at what they were doing that I think it really was more a matter of when, not if, they got caught.
I got a couple of questions that are along the same lines. One of them is from S. Rejdor, if I'm saying that right. Who says, "Who would you call the quote heroes of Watergate?" Which is a good question. I'd be curious to hear how you answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some very clear heroes, which are the Watergate Special Prosecution Force. The special prosecutors, Archibald Cox, who was fired in the Saturday Night Massacre, replaced with Leon Jaworski. And they put together a really incredible team of people who helped bring forward the legal cases that stem from Watergate. Again, we often forget the full scope and scale of Watergate. 69 people ended up being criminally charged and indicted in the course of all of the scandals related to Watergate. I mean, this was a lot more than just the 5 burglars and then the Nixon White House cover-up. I mean, George Steinbrenner was indicted and ended up being convicted of illegal campaign finance donations in the midst of the Watergate scandal. American Airlines, Goodyear Tire, all sorts of brand name American companies ended up pleading guilty to criminal charges stemming from Watergate. So I think that they're part of what I think makes this story so interesting is as you go through those different institutions, each of whom have a role in holding the president to account, there are some remarkable profiles and courage from people who really end up going toe-to-toe with the president.
Yeah, what was interesting though about your book though is 3 people who jump to mind who often get named as the heroes of Watergate, aside from Deep Throat, but are Woodward and Bernstein, obviously because of the movie, and you talk about what a sensation that movie was when it came out in 1976, and also John Dean, because his testimony, he was the first major person who played a whistleblower type role. And reading your book, I mean, you seem to I don't think you would exactly necessarily call John Dean a hero, the way you describe some of his motivations. And also, you have a very nuanced take in Woodward and Bernstein. How would you define those key 3 figures that people are kind of still fascinated with today? And they're all 3 of them are still in the public arena today, 50 years later, which is so amazing.
And by the way, the fact that all 3 of them are still in the public arena is not unrelated to them all being seen as heroes of Watergate. I mean, the advantage that all 3 of them have had is, their own ability to tell their story for a very long period since. That said, they are, John Dean is an enormously complex figure through this, and one of the most fascinating. As a young journalist in Washington, I knew 1,000 John Deans. It is a Washington archetype of that sort of, as John Dean calls himself in his own memoir title, sort of blind ambition, sort of blindly ambition, power hungry, but power agnostic individuals. And John Dean goes very deep into the Watergate cover-up before he sort of realizes that it has gotten out of his control, and ultimately switches sides to cooperate with the prosecutors. And in a very classic case of what anyone who is part of a conspiracy will tell you: if you want to flip, be the first to flip. And he cooperates first with prosecutors and gets himself this tremendous deal, and then is very forthright about telling the truth. And he deserves credit for the fact that he was right about what he said was in the Nixon tapes. I mean, that he testified accurately about the conversations even before he knew that they were being recorded inside the White House. So Woodward and Bernstein also hugely matter in the Watergate story, but in a way that's different than the way that they have been handed down through history, which is, as it sort of turns out, and in many ways I was as surprised as anyone to learn this as I dove into the research. There's a constellation of about a half dozen journalists, including Jack Nelson and Ron Ostro from the Los Angeles Times, Seymour Hersh from the New York Times, Walter Rugaber from the New York Times, who really deserve pride of place alongside Woodward and Bernstein, as well as actually Woodward and Bernstein's editors, in some ways, who are early drivers of the story, folks like Barry Sussman, who are then sort of written out of the Watergate story, written out of All the President's Men, to some great degree of bitterness on their part, as it actually turns out later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I don't know if you mentioned Jack Nelson of the LA Times, who had some amazing scoops. And then blanking out on the name, Time Magazine had a reporter who had a lot of things. And they didn't have movies made about them. So I guess history is written by the winners, as I always say. We have kind of time for one last question. I'm gonna blend a viewer's question with my own add-on to it, which is Kevin Simon now wants to know about whether what Gerald Ford did a month after Nixon resigned, whether it was legal to give a pardon, for unspecified crimes, or was he just giving them immunity? And he wants to know what people thought at the time about the constitutionality about that. I just want to add, it seems to me, and I just wrote a column about this, but to me, the biggest unresolved question of Watergate is the president of the United States above the law? I mean, so many people say no, that nobody should be above the law, but yet, Nixon was pardoned, and now there seems to be this real fear of prosecuting Donald Trump for crimes that seem to have been committed in broad daylight. So I was wondering if you could quickly, in a few minutes, comment on those kind of related issues.
Yeah, it's a super complex one, and I don't know that we have a real clear answer, because the Watergate story is very much one of whether the president is above the law, and Nixon himself sort of argued about this in the Frost-Nixon interviews later. When a president does it, it's not illegal, kind of thing. And he, this whole book, in some ways, is a story of the country wrestling with this question of whether the president is above the law. And it's one that the Watergate Special Prosecution Force really wrestles with. They have real searching debates about, ones that we're still sort of feeling ricochet down through history years later, with in the Mueller investigation, as the Mueller investigation basically starts with the premise that the Watergate prosecutors ended up with, which is that they cannot indict a sitting president as the executive branch. But at the same time, the court's determining that no, the president is not above the law, and that if he faces a valid court order, he needs to comply with that. And I think that there is a real sense and a real fear at this moment, in our modern political context, that we're going to end up with a different answer to that question. That sort of basically, if a politician can stall long enough, if a president can stall long enough, he can escape prosecution. And that's something that Nixon considered. Frankly, he sort of thought he might be able to actually battle his way slow enough through the presidency that he could serve out the rest of his term, and ultimately decided that for the good of the country, and the good of the presidency, he would step down. Donald Trump obviously made a different calculation, and I think
we actually I haven't used all our pictures, but we actually have a good shot of Nixon and Trump to remind people of the the similarities between the two cases, and how how we're still dealing with that today. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just wanted to get that on the screen. So
yeah, and I think that to me is in many ways the instructive part of this story, is sort of how before Congress, our country decided that a president was not above the law, and sort of what lessons we should be taking to this modern moment now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like with Trump in the Justice Department, and we saw this kind of surprising decision by the Manhattan District Attorney last week to not seek criminal charges against Trump, even though his top assistants were recommending that. And it seems like, I feel like, because a president has never been indicted before, it's like nobody wants to be the first one to jump into the pool, right? That nobody really, it's uncharted territory still 50 years later of what would happen if a current president or a recent former president were indicted. And there seems to be, it's such an overwhelming decision that people, I feel like people are intimidated by handling this situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, listen, we've actually gone a few minutes over, so I guess we're out of time. We covered so much, Garrett. That was fantastic. You did as good a job talking about the book as you did writing it. I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the audience for tuning in. We should do one thing before we go, which is tell people one last time what's the best way for them to go out, and if they haven't read Watergate: A New History yet, what's the best way for people to go find your book?
So you can get it online, Amazon, bookshop.org, barnesandnoble.com, in any of your local independent bookstores, or wherever you like to purchase your books. And then if anyone wants signed or inscribed copies, they can find those on my Twitter feed at VermontGMG. Yeah, you should definitely follow Garrett. It's like you said, it's VermontGMG. He's got a cool Twitter feed, and actually Garrett didn't mention, but you can also listen to the book on Audible, which is actually what I did, and he had a really good narrator. It was very impressive. So good. Well, thanks for tuning in, everybody, and hopefully in a few months we'll see you for the second installment of the Will Bunch Culture Club, whatever that'll be. So thanks again for coming, everybody. Take care. Thanks so much for having me, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. I really appreciate it.